Hey, what's going on, friends? So excited to be back with you here today for this next Monday training that we're having together. We've been doing this over the last few weeks. We've been jumping on, just taking a few minutes talking about some relevant topics, issues, frameworks for leading your college and young adult ministry. For the last few weeks, we have been talking about this idea of what do we measure? Right? So, are we making sure that we're measuring the right things? Are we accurate and honest in our measurement? And so, several weeks ago, we talked about that numbers weren't the only thing that we should be measuring. And so, we spent some time looking at some other ways in which that we can measure how we're doing, the fruit that of the impact that we're making. Then we spent some time looking a couple weeks ago, looking at really formation, right? And so the goal, ultimately, discipleship, and how do we see transformation in the lives of the different students and young adults that we're connected to. Last week we spent some time looking at culture, right? So what does it look like to analyze the culture? Now what we want to do today is actually look at, after we've gone through that process of analyzing, so what are we measuring, the formation, the discipleship, the culture, and now all of a sudden you're sitting there with some data points, right? So we're not saying that numbers don't matter, right? But we're saying that those aren't the only thing or necessarily the thing that we should land on long term. But what do we do with those numbers once we have gone kind of through that process? And so you could be sitting with a question right now of like, there's been a number dip, or there's been kind of some things that we're not happy with. And so what do you do? Because now all of a sudden you're stuck between knowing some of this information and what do we exactly do with that? And that's what we want to talk about for just a few minutes here today. And I want to encourage you, if you're in that season where you're kind of stuck between knowing, I've done some of the analyzing, I've looked at some of the behind the scenes things that are happening, some of the other measurements. Discipleship really is our heart. We're seeing a healthy culture, and yet maybe you're not happy with maybe some of the metrics that you're seeing. So how do you begin to make decisions on that? So how do we carry that data point and actually begin to make decisions based off of it? I got a story a few weeks ago. I was with a leader. We were talking through Sunday morning attendance, right, from his Sunday school class, that he was looking kind of early on in the spring. It had dropped from about 30 to 40, pretty strong, pretty consistent. All of a sudden, they was seeing a dip in numbers, right? So he's looking at this real number. He's honestly looking at it. He's asking the question, and we're beginning to process with this is like, okay, is this just a summer dip that we need to wait out? Right? He had this number, he knew that it was real. Is there a sense of we just need to wait this thing out, or is there something that actually needed to be shifted, something that needed to actually begin to move to help begin to move this forward? So what we want to do today is actually I want to talk with you for just a few minutes about a framework, but let's talk about really the shift that we need to think through. And the shift is understanding kind of the observation of, man, something isn't right? We're not seeing the impact that we want. We're not seeing the fruit that we want. Something feels off. And then the next move is like, what has to change, right? So that you can move from observation to really like implementation or beginning to make progress. And so sometimes the numbers will tell you that it must change, but it doesn't always show you what needs to change. Like what do you change, right? So we see some of the measurements that we have. So what exactly do we need to change? And so when you begin to look at some of the kind of actual stories and people behind it, you can begin to feel kind of this pressure. And here's the thing I want to encourage us as leaders is, one of the things that we need to recognize is like we need to step back and in some ways kind of remove ourselves from being so tied to certain models. And this is one of the things that I think has been important for the conversations is like, we can, a lot of times when we're talking to leaders, there's a couple things that we see in terms of like being tied to a model, right? And so it can be, number one is it can be maybe something that they have done over the last several years, the last decade, right? So that it can be this pressure of like, well, this is the way that we've always done it. The second thing that we often will see is there can be pressure in terms of like, man, this is what somebody else is doing. Therefore, there's kind of this pressure to have to shift. Now, I want to kind of give a caveat to what we're talking about, this idea of modeling. The numbers is never the whole verdict, right? So when we've been talking about the over the last few weeks of like, it is only one piece of the data, right? So you're looking at maybe numbers, you're looking at the ebbs and flows of that. We want to be reading that alongside actually some of the other things that we've been looking at over the last few weeks when it looks about formation, when we think about input, output, impact measures that we talked about several weeks ago, when we think about culture, right? We want to use numbers as kind of a comparison with those other ways in which we're beginning to uh, measure. Okay, so here's what I want to do: is when you've gone through that process and you begin to measure some of these pieces, and you're beginning to like think about culture, think about formation. I want to walk you through when the numbers aren't exactly where you want them to be, asking the question, is it an adjustment we need to make, or is there a new model or new method, a new tactic that we need to begin to implement? Because that's often the question of like, okay, is it micro changes and adjustments that need to be made, or is there a sense where we actually need to make some more drastic changes where you think about even changing your model? Okay. So I want to give you kind of 5 steps to kind of walk through this that will help you kind of step back and say, do I need an adjustment or do we need a new model? Okay, so number 1, and we do this quite a bit, is we want to like be honest, right? We want to actually be honest with where things are actually at. So the leader, that we're talking through a few minutes ago, is he's like, well, honestly, like this is where it's at. This is where we're at right now. And so we wanted to make sure that it wasn't like a tension of sometimes feeling like it should be more, not based off of plain numbers. So we want to really just say those numbers plainly. Don't want to soften it. We don't want to think about it in terms of comparison of like, hey, here's where we were a year ago or 3 years ago. Like, and be okay with some of the analyzing of where we're at without making excuses, right? So we want to be honest and vulnerable about that. But here's the second thing that we want to begin to do. Okay. So number 1 is going to be honest. Number 2 is going to be to ask a diagnostic question, right? So often what will happen is if we can step back and kind of look at maybe like the 15,000-foot view of what's happening, we can begin to recognize that there are other things that are maybe broken in the system that are actually the effect that is why we're seeing what we're seeing. So here's the question I want you to ask. It's this question like, okay, if everything ran perfectly, okay, in your program or your systems or your function or your follow-up or whatever, right, would the number move? Okay. So it's actually stepping back and asking the question of like, okay, if as we analyze some of the things that are happening and some of the let's say our leaders aren't showing up on time, or man, they're not following through with callbacks, or they're we're not getting into groups fast enough, and so we need to kind of step back and ask this diagnostic of like, okay, if things were exactly how we diagrammed, and here's the thing, I talk to this leaders all the time. It's never like the whiteboard, right? So we have these whiteboard sessions and we're like, here's what it needs to look like, and here's our flow, here's our path, here's what we need to do. And it's never like that, right? So it's always this tension of like we're dealing with imperfect people. We're imperfect people as leaders. Our systems often have kind of gaps in them. But if you're to look at it and say, okay, if that in your best kind of analysis, if those things were to be fixed and everything was supposed to run like it was supposed to, would you see more momentum or movement? And so if that's a yes, then really the answer to that is an adjustment, right? So then you need to step back and say, what are the adjustments that need to be made? Um, Tune, modify, update, right? So what are the adjustments that need to be made? If the answer to that is no, right? You said, okay, if everything worked fine, it still wouldn't see the numbers. And then what you needed to say is like, is there a different way? Is there a new model for how we need to go about and do this? Okay. So if things are working perfectly and it's yes, then it's an adjustment. If it's no, then we need to kind of step back and say, okay, is there some type of like new model, new tactic that we need to implement? Okay. So number one is be honest, say it plainly. Number two is ask that diagnostic question, adjustment or model. Number three is going to be an analysis to check it against what you actually care about. Okay. Because this is really important. Like, so even if the number were to move, and I think we skip this a lot of times, even let's say in this leader's case, if you were to go back to 40 to 50 people at Sunday school class on Sunday morning, even if that number were to move, when you begin to ask whether the thing underneath it, the depth, the formation, the people, would that actually help you move in terms of some of the other measurements we've talked about? So a number can improve on paper, but we can still have a real problem. And that's why it's important for us to not just measure off of numbers, but to have other data points that we're taking in terms of the movement and the development. And so this just kind of creates like a almost like a check and balance to kind of step back and say, okay, like if this were to move in the right direction, is it actually doing what we want to do? Because sometimes we make the end game just numbers, right? So we want to increase our midweek, we want to increase our number of people in our discipleship, which is good, but I think we need to take another step beyond that and check that against what we really care about, what we think is really important, like we've talked about over the last several weeks of the formation, the people, and the depth, and ask the question of like, okay, is it going to help produce what we want to produce? Okay, so number one is we need to say it plainly. Number two is we need to ask those diagnostic questions of like, is it an adjustment or is it a new model? Number three is check it against what we actually care about, some of the other pieces that we need. Here's number four is this idea. There's a temptation, and I'll just say this from experience for me as a leader. There's a temptation for me to out effort a model problem. Here's what I mean by that is I can do a lot by working harder, right? I can push harder, I can go longer, I can go later. Like I can do, but that may not be the answer. And so there can be a tension where we can like out effort the real problem, right? So if the answer is a new model, more hustle, more hard work doesn't fix a broken model. It just is going to burn you out and you're going to be running harder, longer the wrong system. And so we need to like recognize even in ourselves of saying the temptation for us and even knowing this about ourselves is that we need to make sure that we're not out efforting just a model problem. And here's the fifth one for you is build for where you're headed, not just where you're at, right? So don't think about just like how do we serve just the young adults that are currently in our sphere. But when we think about like building, we need to think about two or three or four steps ahead, right? So would this model continue to serve for us? I was sharing this with a leader a few weeks ago. There's a reading a book. I'm trying to remember if it was like Church 3.0, I think by Neil Cole. He was talking about this the comparison between addition and multiplication, like the mindset of addition versus the mindset of multiplication, and how often people who are stuck in a mindset of addition are building for the current reality, right? So how do we serve are current people. People who are thinking in mindset are often thinking 2, 3, 4 steps ahead to say, we actually, what we need to be building now is going to begin to support more. And that's a mindset of multiplication. I want to give you a story real quick as we think about these five. So just quick five review on the five. Number one is be honest. Number two is ask that diagnostic question. Number three, check it against other data points. Number four is don't out effort that if it's a model problem. Number five is like build for where you're heading, just not where you're currently at in that moment. I was with a leader several weeks ago now. It's probably maybe even 2 months ago now. We were talking about they were getting ready for their ministry kickoff in the fall. And so we were talking about that last year they had several hundred students that were coming to their midweek gathering, and they only had really 3 or 4 small groups, right? So they were recognizing that there were really like hundreds of students that were landing nowhere. And so as we're kind of talking through the diagnosing kind of this problem, we are talking about some of their systems. One of the things that we recognized is their current system, their current, we'll just call it like your assimilation system, wasn't built for that many students, right? So we actually had to kind of rework and reframe and relook at that system to begin to think about how to care. And here's one of the things I encouraged this leader to do is don't just build it off of current, but think about 2 years out, right? So if you're at I think they're running like 700-800 students. And we were talking about like, okay, what would it actually look like to build a system for 1,500 students, right? Because that is going to be the model that you don't want to build for current, but ultimately the future. And so we were talking about the assimilation and the care and some of those things that weren't just the numbers of what we can get fixated on, but how do we begin to measure that against other things? And what they recognized was it wasn't a tweak, right? It was actually a new system that needed to be implemented. So when you think about 5 steps, say it plainly. Number 2, make sure you're diagnosing is an adjustment or a new model. Number 3, check it against actually what you care about, not just numeric data points. Number 4 is don't out effort a model problem. And then number 5 is build for where you're heading, not just currently where you're at. So here's what I'd encourage you to do. We've done this over the last few weeks. Here's a couple questions for you to sit with this week. Question number 1, I encourage you to journal, to reflect on what number are you actually sitting on that you haven't acted on, right? So there's often things that we're kind of putting to the back burner, or things we're kind of in paralysis mode. What's that number that you've compared against some of the other metrics, the data points, and you just haven't numbered on that? Secondly is then to go through that and run through this framework specifically around, is this adjustment or is this a new model? And then what are you actually avoiding, right? So often we're avoiding some of the adjustments because they're hard conversations, or they're actually kind of like helping equip people more effectively. If it's a new model, we're avoiding because we're maybe afraid of the fallback or the blowback that we're going to experience from that because of some of the bigger adjustments that we need to make. So what are you currently sitting with that you haven't acted on? As you look at that, is that just simply an adjustment, or is that a new model? And then, and here's the third question I encourage you to think through is what's a number that you've been treating as the whole story that you haven't done a good job of adding some other evaluation points? I want to bring that back to that from a few weeks ago, because like we talked about it almost the first week we started talking about what we're measuring. This is the easy thing to measure, right? It shouldn't be the only thing we measure, but it's the thing that we most default on when it comes to ministry, because it's the easiest for us. Now, I want to kind of give you a quick highlight. This is actually going to be our last Monday leadership until October. I'm heading to Africa for a few weeks to do some training with some church leaders over there. Next week's a holiday, so there will be several weeks we're off. But here's what I want to kind of seed you with is in November, we're actually going to be putting together a cohort talking about different ministry models, right? So a lot of times we just don't recognize that there's a lot of different ways that we can do things. And so what we want to do is actually spend some time looking at some different models, how that would look in your ministry, what would be the impact and the benefit of some of the different models we talked through. It'll just kind of help you give some data points in terms of like maybe some shifts that you need to make. So we're really excited about that opportunity here that's going to be happening probably the end of October, beginning of the November. So if that's something that you're interested in, we'd love to um, make that accessible to you. So excited. Amazing stuff happening these last few weeks. I know for a lot of you, if you're watching this close to when we recorded it, welcome weeks and kickoff events and midweek starting and groups launching, lots of that fun stuff. So it's been amazing to see everything that God is doing over these last few weeks. If you need something, reach out to our team. We'd love to connect with you. Hopefully this was helpful today as you begin to kind of analyze where some of the numbers maybe are at, and then some next steps that you can do to help move it forward. Okay, we'll talk to you later. See you soon.